apyayantu mamangani vak pranashchakshu shrotramatho balamindriyani cha sarvani sarvam brahma upanishadam maham brahma nirakuryam mama brahma nirakarot anirakaranam astvanirakaranam me astu tadatmani nirate upanishatsu dharmaste mayi santu te mayi santu. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Therefore, the question was, is there a presence because of which all uncommon objects are recognized? And according to Kena Upanishad, that presence is you. That presence is obtaining as your very I am, which is known to everyone. It is Swataha Siddha. It is known to you for the longest time available. However, we miss it because we constantly focus on forms. We focus on what is to be done, what I need to do, right? So just life kind of takes over and it just becomes something that's completely missed out, even though it is the very presence that is revealing your entire life from, since you were a child. And the question states that this presence in whom your mind operates, this presence is in whom your senses see, this presence is in whom hearing takes place. In other words, is bringing something out. And that is, we are accustomed to believe or think that what reveals sounds or what recognizes sounds or what makes sounds known is the mind. What makes the senses known is the mind. What makes forms known is the mind. And this is ignorance. This is because of atyasa. So this is how everyone gets born, thinking that the final reality, that the subject, the I am, is the mind. That I am is, the kind of like the person that's aging. So this is what the Kena Upanishad is showing you, that your actual I am is other than the mind. It is in whose presence your thoughts and emotions are constantly coming and going. They're known because of this constant, ever non-changing, surviving presence. That means it survives all of the things that are coming and going, coming and going. Your mind, as we said, is changing every single day, 60,000 times a day, having different thoughts, different opinions about itself, different conclusions about the world. This has been going all day long, all lifelong, and never does it occur to the individual to say, how can this changing mind, how can it be known to itself? How can the so-called mind, if the mind was to be who I am, the person never asks, then how can that mind, which is supposedly intelligent, how can it know about ignorance? If the nature of your mind was intelligent, then, and the whole essence of your mind is intelligence, then how can it know about non-intelligence? Because it would be looking everything through intelligence. And if the mind, the nature of the mind is, suppose the mind was ignorant and you were that mind, and that mind is ignorance, then how can that mind recognize knowledge? In other words, the only way that both knowledge of something and ignorance of something can be recognized, which always belongs to the mind, because one moment you don't know the word girl in Latin, which is puella. So look at this. Now you know. You know the girl word in Latin, puella. But just a moment ago, you did not know the word puella. Now, a moment ago, I could have asked you what's the word for girl in Latin, and you says, I know that I don't know. In other words, I know that my mind doesn't know. In other words, in the presence of I, there is a mind which doesn't know that the word puella is girl. And then I told you the word puella for girl. In the presence of that same I, there is recognition that this mind now knows that the word for girl is puella. In other words, in order to know about ignorance and to know about knowledge, you have to be free of both ignorance and knowledge. Otherwise, if you were ignorance, then you can't recognize knowledge. If you are knowledge, you can't recognize ignorance. And ignorance and knowledge, as I've just demonstrated, always happens in the instrument, which we call the knowing instrument, but not knowing as in the absolute knower, the I am knowing, the mind, which is just filled with what it kind of, knows what it doesn't know. But we're not talking about that knower. We're talking about the knower because of which the mind is revealed. The mind is known to be ignorant. The mind is known to be knowledgeable. Okay? So, this presence, we said, has two features about it. We said it is sadharana. It is common. All throughout your life, there is one commonality. That is self-evident I am. All other than that, it is uncommon. It's coming and going. Once upon a time, you had so many desires of toys and girls and boys. Those desires made up your mind. Those desires are gone. Now the desire is for, suppose, liberation. Now the mind has this new desire for liberation. In the presence of that little girl or boy, there was an I am lighting up the mind, which was filled with desire for girls and boys and toys. Now, years later, in the presence of same I am, that which survives all changes, there is a mind which is filled with a desire to know the truth, to know God, to know the nature of reality. In either way, I am was never affected by knowledge or ignorance. In the stage of ignorance, I know that I don't know who I am. That means there is in the presence of I, who is walking around dissatisfied. On whom is that dissatisfaction based on? Who is walking around dissatisfied? I am walking around dissatisfied. In other words, the seeker, look at this, inquiry. To go into the world and seek. You're seeking for whom? Who are you trying to fill up? Who are you trying to fulfill? The one that is going out. In first person, I am wanting to fulfill me, I. So in other words, just to go out into the world implies you have to know something about I. Otherwise, you wouldn't be going out. But just the fact that you are going out, you're going out to fulfill the I, which means that you don't quite know what I am. Otherwise, you wouldn't be seeking. Therefore, as we started out this course, it's not like a person is totally ignorant of their nature. We call it partial ignorance. If you were totally ignorant, nobody would be seeking to fulfill I am. You would feel totally content with yourself. But that is not the case. There is an I who is walking with the intention that I want this I to be fulfilled. I want this I to be satisfied. In other words, there is no total ignorance of I, but at the same time, I don't know what this I really is. That's why I want to satisfy the I. Therefore, Vedanta wants to show you that there is a certain reality about you which is free of the seeker. And until that reality you come in touch with, The seeking continues. Comparing philosophies continues. Going to the world continues. Discrediting this continues. Putting down the gurus continues. Talking about how others don't get it continues. Calling the world materialistic. These are lost souls. We're spiritual. All of these ideas continue until the person comes to see that all that is here is Ishvara, which I am not apart from. And therefore, I cannot quite call anything as this or that because everyone is having their own personal journey. So this means the person also comes to understand that if all that is here is one reality, and everyone came to understand that one reality, you came to understand that one reality, I came to understand that one reality. Therefore, the journey becomes of respecting each other's journeys. That's what Earth is, a place where we all come together and meet. And everyone's kind of chasing for different things. Boys and toys and girls over here. On the other side, liberation. And yet, both are walking the same planet. That's what this world is, a meeting place. A meeting place of thousands of different desires. And like this, you go through searching and searching and searching until you find out that all of this kind of toys and girls and boys, it didn't satisfy my eye. And then I went into philosophy, comparing, what is this, what are they saying, what are they saying, what are they saying? And even that, who was comparing, dissatisfied eye. So nothing really got fixed. And then the eye says, nothing has worked so far. I just want to understand what I am. I'm tired of searching, tired of comparing, tired of criticizing. I just want to relax in my truth of who I am. And that's where the committed student comes to class. And now they are open. They want transformation. And these are ideal students. These will be, if everyone was like this, it will be lovely. But in reality, there is always a mixture. Because as we said, Earth is a place where we all come together from different kind of ideas, what needs to happen. And so you have to kind of weave your way through those who are resisting until one day, slowly, you realize, wow, all of those things that I was resisting, they were just showing me what was true. I was true all along. There was nothing wrong with anything. All of the things that I thought were wrong with my own private ideas. And all this tradition has done has popped all of these ideas, millions of bubbles, just pop. What the guru should look like, what the teacher should not look like, what the teaching should sound like, what the reality should be, all private bubbles get popped out. And then you just finally relax and realize it was never about making your life a search, but coming to this place to discover who you are, enjoy one last life of recognizing that all that is here is one, and then leaving this place. In other words, the purpose was to come here, discover your nature, thank Earth, thank God, and leave. So this way, the teacher always puts you back to what is the highest purpose that you're here. Without being reminded, we lose track, we go off track, and we turn different things into the end of life. Therefore, we come back. My purpose is to know the truth, to know God, my relationship with God. And I can last breath say, thank you, God, I've done all I could. I've tried the best I could. Now you choose what happens to me. Do I come back to do another cycle of searching, or do I finally get released from this constant coming and going inside different forms, having my teeth drilled again, going to mama's lap, tell me a story, give me a cookie, learning new language, going through the hormone stage, finding a new job, going, oh God, another COVID stage, and then going through that again and again and again. And you say, no more. I commit to this journey completely. And therefore, this is a committed student that who comes to the Upanishads to learn. And then we said that this awareness this reality is attributeless. In other words, if you put some attribute onto your awareness, then the thing is that attribute should be there with you all the time, because we're talking about who you are. So if I ask you, who am I? If you say, I am smart, again, smart is an attribute of how much this mind knows in reference to somebody else. If this mind gets placed with little children, it's going to say, I'm smart. But you put the same mind, which you're saying, I am smart, you put this mind in a circle of scientists, and now that mind, that so-called I, mistaken for the mind, cannot say that anymore. So in other words, whatever attribute you give is always relative to some other context or some other environment, or relative to the language or what you understand about what you're calling yourself as or what you know yourself as. In other words, to say that your awareness, your I am, is different from my I am, you are obligated to then tell me that your I am is indeed bound to time and space because it's one form, and my I am is another form. Now, if my I am is a form and your I am is a form, then what form are you going to give to your I am? I should see it. But what am I seeing? I'm just seeing your hair, your eyes, your nose, your body. I'm seeing little brain cells firing and wiring. Where is your I am? Show me. No, it's my thoughts. Well, where are your thoughts when you're in deep sleep? If your mind was I am and you go to deep sleep, is your life in deep sleep there? Do you have a life in deep sleep? Are you there in deep sleep? Is your mind, are your thoughts, are your concerns there in deep sleep? No. So if your I was the mind, then you would go out of existence and you would be afraid to go to deep sleep because you would go out of existence. But we all joyfully run for not a dream, we run for deep sleep, which means that I want to be free of my mind. I want to be free of that which holds all of the concerns, anxieties, worries in my life, because I want to come back to me, the one which is attributeless. This is why deep sleep is so pleasant, because you finally free yourself for those 5 or 6 hours of the person who you think you are. And that feels so satisfying. And we always move towards what we are, and we move farther away from what we are not. In other words, we run towards deep sleep because we know Andre is not going to be there. Okay? But what's going to be there? I will be there. And what is this I? Non-dual awareness. Okay. Then we said, in order to show how awareness is the truth of all objects, is the truth of time and space and objects, which I haven't quite shown yet. First of all, we performed an inquiry to show that you can put the entire world that you live in into one of these 3 categories, which you cannot put awareness. And the reason I'm showing this is it's going to be helpful later on to show you a satya, a connection, a relationship between objects and awareness. And to see, because I know what you're going to ask. So far I've been saying awareness is attributeless. And then eventually what we're going to say is the world, which is full of attributes, resolves into awareness. How can a world full of attributes resolve into attributeless awareness? You see the contradiction? This means we have to resolve that contradiction. Before I do that, we said that, for example, let's say Sajatiya Bheda would say something like, right, 2 minds, right? So this will be mind 1, this will be your mind, and then mind 2, this will be somebody else's mind, okay? Mind. In other words, mind of 2 human beings, right? So Sajatiya means same group. So same group means like human beings, right? So we can now say the mind of human being 1 and mind of human being 2. So here we can say something like, in other words, mind belongs to Sajatiya Bheda. It belongs to an attribute. Here we can say, your mind is different from a tree, okay? There are 2 different groups. Or how about this? Your mind is different from Mind is what's called subtle matter. Physical matter is your brain. Like that's what neurologists deal with. They kind of hook up the instruments and they see electricity. They see like gray matter. So that brain will put here, okay? So it's different matter than your mind. Your mind is a different kind of matter than a physical brain. Why? Because I can see your physical brain under a microscope, but how far do I have to dig in to see a thought? Where will I find a thought in your physical brain? And what is your brain made of? Atoms. Just atoms. Basically just reduces to atoms under a microscope. So which atom will have a green tree that you're imagining right now? Which kind of atom should I find like a little leaf, and another atom I should find, a bark? You see? In other words, no matter which atom you look at of your brain, you're not going to find your subjective experience of a memory with your grandfather, with your grandmother, or that, that door that I said. You're not going to find it there. And yet, there is a difference between the mind and the brain. In other words, the mind requires the brain, and they work together to form this experience. Okay? So in other words, your mind fits in Vijatiya Bheda, it's an attribute, and the brain is also an attribute. And then Swagata Bheda, you take your mind. Who remembers what the mind is made of?
Manas, Buddhi, Chitta, and Ahankara.
Excellent. I think you said matter or brain. That was physical brain. But Manas, Buddhi, Chitta, Ahamkara was right. So in English, Manas means the system that emotes, that sends corresponding emotions, and you're happy, hopefully, when someone's at a wedding, versus being jealous. In other words, there's some discord between what is happening versus what I feel. Your memory is what helps you to kind of connect all of these pieces together and form one total, connect the pieces that you've heard from before, connect them to now. Your buddhi is the cognitive capacity, which is able to think how to reconcile apparent contradictions. In other words, if there's two contradictions, which you just said, on one hand, you have attributeless awareness, and on the other hand, we say that this world full of attributes resolves into that awareness. Your buddhi goes, something's not right here. That means your buddhi is working. Now the buddhi has to reconcile that, or at least understand how to reconcile it, which we will go through. Now, so these three categories want to show you that anything you choose, no matter what it is, I just gave you some simple examples. Anything you can throw here, it will fit into one of these three categories. Now, you say, why do I need to know this? Well, when it comes to your I am, we said that you cannot put your I am anywhere, because we said clearly, you can't say that my I am is different from your I am. Why not? No attributes. Just simple answer. It's very easy. Okay, so in other words, I can't do that. Because if you were to do that, then again, I would have to see your awareness and you have to see my awareness. Now, can you put your awareness in Swagata Bheda? In other words, for example, waking state awareness and dream awareness and samadhi awareness? No. Why not? Yeah, it lights up equally your waking state and it lights up your dream state. That's why you say, I was there in my dream. And that same I that was there in the dream. Who remembers their dream, by the way? Who sees their dream clearly? Yeah? So if you do, then this will be a little bit easier, because most kind of don't see dreams. But you will have clear understanding that the same I that knows itself to be who I am is exactly the same I that is there in the dream. But what's different between here and in the dream? Everything. Right? The stories, Mickey Mouse, right? Whatever, cartoon characters, it all gets mixed up in the dream. But who's there observing that mix-up, that weirdness? The same I am that's observing this more stable environment, this more reliable. Because in the dream, it's all kind of like moving, right? Flexible, nothing really stays. Okay. Therefore, you cannot say that consciousness is made up of parts, because to say part 1 and part 2, I must have been in both. If you were in part 1 and you're no longer, and that you goes out of existence by the time you go inside the dream, then you would never say I dreamt, because it was a different person who was in a dream. But because it's one I am, you say, in the presence of me, there was a dream. Okay. And we said Vijati Abheda, is your I am, like your self-evident I am, unlike this flower? You will naturally say, until we go through the analysis, of course it is. You know, my I am, you know, kind of lights up my mind, lights up the world. But this is just a flower. But the answer is, no, there's no difference, because your I am happens to be the content of the whole universe. So now, to demonstrate that, before we get there, I just want to cover a few more points. Revision. Okay, so there's no hurry. Revision. We also said, what about space? Which category is space in? Do you remember? Vijati Abheda. And could you explain to me why is space in Vijati Abheda?
Comparable with anything.
It's not comparable with anything, right? Is that? Yeah. In other words, it's unlike anything. So in other words, space is space, and it accommodates this pen, but it is not this pen. Were it to be this pen, then you would have pens everywhere. Same thing with time. It is unlike anything else, and there is no second time, and there is no, kind of like dream time and waking time. It's just one time perceived differently. As I said, you perceive dating someone you like in the presence of I. Time is very different than time when you're waiting for the bus, desperately waiting to go to your job. In other words, the same I am is there, but the mind is perceiving, right? In the presence of by the help of the mind, there are changes observed, and in the presence of I am, that mind is lit up. We could say that space has an attribute. If I say to you, what is an attribute of space? Because remember, awareness is attributeless. And space, I could say, is an attribute, has an attribute. What attribute would you give to space? This requires a little bit of thinking.
Accommodative. It accommodates.
Good, okay, fast thinker. So if you think about space, it allows things to distinguish themselves. For example, space, in the presence of space, this can be distinguished from this. But is there any other object in this universe that allows two objects to be distinguished? Did you get the question? So space, by the presence of space, it accommodates the pen and it accommodates the eraser. Both the pen and the eraser are in the presence of space. Space, because it's accommodating both, is able to distinguish this object from this object. In other words, because of space, two objects can be distinguished. Is there any other object, any other thing in this universe that can do what space does? Time. Time can also do that, yeah. But space analysis is being conducted now. Can anything else, can a chair distinguish this and this? No. Because if it were to distinguish, then the chair was sort of, this will kind of like melt inside the chair. So in other words, what is one attribute of space? It is that which helps all objects distinguish themselves. In that sense, you could say it is an attribute. Is this clear? Okay. In other words, again, it's that which helps all objects be different. And no other object except space can do that, except space itself. Yes?
But Could you also say, like space is the subtlest matter that is possible? No?
Yes,
It is matter.
it is matter indeed, yeah. So in that sense,
You couldn't call it an attribute.
yeah, so it is kind of it's something to think about. It's not, you could say that it's the only thing, it's vijatya, it's the only attribute, it's the only kind of reality that's able to help all other objects distinguish themselves. And there's nothing else that can do that. Yeah, so in that sense, you can kind of say it's an attribute.
And it's also an object for consciousness. It's an object.
Yeah, yes, it is now, but that's not, we're not bringing consciousness, we're just staying with space itself. Yeah, it is an object. It's, how is space an object of consciousness? We'll just go along with this inquiry. How is space an object of consciousness?
You can infer by seeing different objects, distance, for example.
Yeah, so in other words, you get two objects like this. Now, what is space? You can only have space, you can only know space, objectify space in reference to two objects. In other words, there is a certain distance between object 1 and 2. In reference to that distance, there is space. What about in Nirvikalpa Samadhi? What happens to space there? Or deep sleep? It goes away. In other words, space is still subject to disappearance. Whereas you cannot disappear. You remain the same. As we said, if you were to disappear in deep sleep, we would all be totally terrified to go to deep sleep. But you know you won't go out of existence in deep sleep, even though your mind will temporarily resolve. Same thing in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. For those who have meditated, if you do meditate, this will make sense. For those who haven't, you won't quite connect with this. But those who do meditate will know that you can have a moment where there is no sense of life, no person. It's just I am, the one who is right here, right now. And this experience helps you a lot to understand that you are free of this mind. Without that, it becomes a little bit more trickier. This is why in the yoga school, they have a certain protocol to help you understand who you are. In fact, in the Gita, we will talk about today meditation and how meditation can help you to make the mind much more subtler to understand these realities. As long as the mind is ruminating on thoughts and comparisons and all of these kind of facts and intellectualizing, it's still not able to capture what we're talking about. It's trying to find intellectual arguments to explain away, right? To kind of explain awareness. Awareness cannot be explained through intellectual arguments. This means as long as the mind is trying to turn this knowledge into some kind of a thing to compare to something else, that's not what Vedanta is about. Vedanta is just showing you the reality. If I take that and I turn it into some kind of a thing to dispute, then it cannot help me. So this means there's one point when the person, as I said earlier on, comes to a point and says, let me understand. Let me just understand what this vision is talking about. Rather than to, may the Lord help me to give me enough patience, enough humility to understand the knowledge, rather than to find kind of holes and dispute it and to continue the search. Because you have to ask yourself, when do I want the search to end? In fact, just to be reborn implies that the search was already happening and many things were done before. A lot of thinking, a lot of searching. And what has that all led you to? Welcome back. One more life. Therefore, Vedanta just wants to show you that as long as you see yourself as a separate individual, that is exactly how you appear. That is exactly what you will see yourself as every single life like this. In fact, right now, one sees themselves as an individual. A wise person does not see themselves as an individual because their understanding is, even though there is an appearance of an individual here, it is one reality appearing as all of this. To a non-wise person, they just see a person talking, mouth moving, and they're like, what is he talking about? What are they pointing to? And that's the experience of a non-wise person. It's totally true. And yet, there is so much more to know that is going on right now. And this reality, as we said, awareness cannot be objectified. It is the only reality that you cannot objectify. So it is like soap. Every time you try to grasp the conscious subject, it slips right off. You can't grasp it. But the mind wants to grasp it. It wants to write an essay about it. It wants to sort of turn it into something that you can describe, something mysterious. It is the only reality that is not subject to being objectified in your mind. You cannot think it. You cannot turn it into a sensation, into a feeling, into an argument, into a disagreement, into an agreement. It is that which, or in whose presence, your attempts to know it become known, or your complaints that you don't know it become known. In other words, someone's complaining, I don't know this reality. I want to know it. What is lighting that mind up? I am. And then that very mind comes to understand the reality. And then it says, I know who I am. What is lighting that mind up? The same I am. But now that mind has no more doubts. That's the only difference. The I am never got changed. Only the mind got removed. The doubts got removed. That I am something this small and I need to make it in this life. So what is the cost if your identity is placed in the mind or the body? You say, so what? So what's the big deal? You know, I like the world. I want to come back. What's the cost?
Suffering. That's what you get.
Little by little, right? It's all it's so slow, it's not a big deal. You know, you say, what's the big deal? It's fine. Because it's not only suffering here, there's also joys. And so every joy you can have for every suffering or downfall. The cost is also mortality. When the moments come, when a person gets older, then they start to get a little bit concerned, you know, what will happen to me? And then very, very close to death. What now? How much work have I done? Have I died doubting? Am I about to die without having figured anything out? Just spend my life comparing things, criticizing things. Or can I die with gratitude that I have done the best I could with commitment, with dedication, and I'm not afraid because there was no more that I could have done than I have done. In other words, one starts to look at their life in gratitude and you're not afraid because you have done all you could. You've attended the classes, you've listened to the Upanishads, hopefully, you thought about it, self-reflected. There's nothing to fear now. And as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna asks out of a mere concern, what happens if I die and I've done so much work on myself? Will I kind of just turn into a worm and then restart my whole progress? Krishna promises, the Lord promises, once you begin the spiritual search, from no more can you come back as a plant or some animal or something. Your journey from then on is always upwards. That means you get reborn in a family of righteous people who will quickly introduce you and inculcate the right values, which will help you to not develop any personal complexes, how I can't, I'm not good enough. And this will help you then to have confidence to approach the right teacher, to sit down with humility, listen and solve the beginningless problem, which has gotten you still here, one more life. Okay, so there is a cost. Mortality, limitation. And what's the benefit of understanding who you are? You gain limitlessness. That means you don't lose anything out. This is the common fear. I don't want to die just being awareness. It's not like that. This is a wrong understanding. You're not losing anything out. You are gaining everything because everything is already you. You're not losing out on the rainbow, on the sunshine, on the beach, because the whole thing is already you. Otherwise, why would I pursue a reality that is limited? What's the incentive? What's the motivation to pursue something that is lacking the rainbows and the sunshine? Therefore, if reality is one, then where's the question of losing out? You're only gaining everything. In fact, to be reborn as a human being, you are losing out. Because you're not born as somebody else. You're born as one single individual who's only going to live 80 years, not 90. And even if you're born as a 90-year-older, you won't live 100 years old. So to be reborn, you're literally subscribing to limitation all across the board. You're subscribing to forgetfulness, to competition, to having to navigate your way with others who also want to kind of get the same job. Therefore, the journey is reclaiming who you are, which is limitlessness itself. Limitlessness means it's not two. There's only one of me. One of me who is appearing as Andre, one of me who is appearing as Sean, one of me who is appearing as this world. One. And the journey is to understand, how is that possible? I don't understand. Because as long as you see yourself as two, the search continues, the search continues, the search continues. So the rewards are huge. Now, we've said that awareness is attributeless. And attributeless means it cannot be two. That's what attributeless means. It's not two. Is this clear so far? Okay. And we have sort of introduced that everything depends on this awareness. I haven't quite displayed or shown you this yet. I've shown you that your thought depends on I am. In other words, no thought can be outside I am. Wherever there's a thought, who's watching that thought? I am watching that thought. In other words, the thought, the object, the known needs the knower. The subject, in the presence of the subject, an object is known. In the presence of a knower, that which is known comes out, is revealed. Knower can never be the same as the known. If they were the same, then who knows about that? There always has to be a conscious subject to know about the object. However, you will say now, that means there's two things. There's a subject and there's an object. So this means we're still in duality, and we have to reconcile this. So how will we do this? We do this using a certain methodology called Satya Mithya, which is the essence of Vedanta. And where most things go wrong is not understanding this. And therefore, the person just cannot reconcile reality. So what Satya means is what is independent, what is self-dependent, what is just independent of anything else. And Mithya does not mean illusion. There's no words of illusion in Advaita Vedanta. This is pop spirituality. We don't call anything illusion here. Mithya just means dependent reality, okay? That means it's dependent on something else. Now let's take any object. Let's take wood. Do we have wood here? We have that wood. Right? Okay, we'll stick with the chair. You have two things. Initially, it seems like it's two things. A chair and you have wood. Now this chair has its being in the wood. So we're not discarding the chair. We're just using the chair as a name and a form. A name that describes the wood taking this form. The wood pervades the entirety of the chair. The chair is functional. I need the chair to sit down. I need the chair to build a boat. Wherever I see the chair, I am simultaneously seeing the wood. Wherever I try to look for the wood, I will find the wood. There is no place where I cannot find the wood, the substance. In other words, the substance pervades the form. And because that form looks like that, we have to call it a chair. Why do we call it a chair? Because the wood can also take a form of a boat. Therefore, to distinguish for functional, transactional reasons, to distinguish a boat from a chair, you have to give them both different kind of names. It's not like the boat is different from the chair. You understand? It's only different in reference to the form which you then attach a name onto. Again, why do you attach these names onto them? Why so many names for different kind of wooden things? Because I need to transact with them. If I want to buy, for example, a boat, like a wooden boat, do you go to the shop and say, hey, give me some wood? Isn't it interesting? You go, I want to buy, even though wood is the boat, you still don't say, I want to buy the wood. You say, I want to buy the boat. But you know that the boat is nothing but the wood. So you know that the boat is nothing but the wood, and yet you don't ask for the wood, you ask for the boat. Because the boat has a functional reality to it. If you take the wood out, do you have the boat? If you take the wood out, do you have the chair? If I break the boat, if I break the chair and I kind of reassemble it into the ugliest thing you've ever seen in your life, the ugliest statue ever, what is your disgust in reference to? The wood or the statue? The statue. And then we make a beautiful heart, something that just melts you. It incites amazing emotions in you. Those emotions are incited in reference to the wood or the form. In other words, the substance can obtain as the ugliest thing ever, and it will incite one kind of emotion in you, and that very substance can obtain as something totally different, and you can melt. But you are melting and being disgusted in reference to the name and form, not to the substance. The substance pervading the name and form. The name and form entirely depends upon the substance. The substance remains independent of the name and form. Therefore, the substance we call satyam. And for the time being, we call the form mithya. Why is form called mithya? Because the form, although it is transactional and useful, it has no existence without that which it needs for its existence. To enjoy a certain form that it can incite, it can instill inspiration, it's borrowing the wood. But there is actually no difference between the wood and the statue. Because the entire statue is nothing but the wood. And yet when it comes to the name and the form, there is a difference. So there is a difference and there is no difference. Which one is it? It is both. If I say there is no difference or there is a difference, then that is not, that's Dvaita. Non-duality means you come to understand that the form does not contradict the substance. The two kinds of statues, which are totally different and meant for different purposes, do not contradict the very substance, the very content which they need to exist. So for the time being, mithya is that which depends on Satyam. Mithya is the boat or the statue, and Satyam is the same wood. If you have 50 sculptures, all meant for different purposes, and they're all wood, and you go shopping, it's one of those, not black markets, those busy days in America when it's Stampede, Black Friday, right? Suppose you just got thousands, never mind 50, thousands of wooden sculptures, all made out of the same wood. And then you have a swarm of people fighting and punching over a Shiva statue made out of wood. And it's like, why are you fighting and punching? It's just wood. There's just wood everywhere. No, you don't understand. We don't have no value for the wood. We have value for the name and form. That is our own personal value for the name and form. Why don't you just take a big chunk of wood? We have no value for that wood. Even though the wood is required to make the statue, they're fighting for the name and form. And yet the name and form entirely depends on the wood. And yet nobody wants the wood. They want the name and form, which is nothing but the wood. This is very strange behavior. How does this work? Because the focus, the value is on the form. The disregard is for the substance. Who needs the substance? And yet the substance is what gives form and shape and existence to every one of these objects, which the person is willing to pay $10,000 for the Buddha statue made out of wood, and someone's only willing to pay $1 here for a piece of marble made out of wood. Same wood, different form. So who's attaching value to $10,000 and $1,001? Who's doing that? Is the wood doing that? The one who's doing that is the one who is ignoring the real value, which is the wood. As long as I have ignorance of the wood, I give value to the form. Therefore, forms become the purpose of living. Forms I start to surround myself with, entangle myself with, left and right. Now, Vedanta goes one step further. It says you cannot stop here. You need to keep on analyzing this. Reality is not wood. We've got the universe of forms. How do we resolve that? Well, if you look at wood and you break down wood further, what is wood made out of? Mere molecules, lignin molecules, cellulose molecules. 2 molecules put together make up wood. So this means wood entirely depends on molecules. So what are you fighting for now? The Buddha statue, the wood, or molecules? So this means now the wood loses its status of Satyam, and what gains status of Satyam? The molecules.
You are talking here about the material.
The material.
Yeah, and not the intelligent.
We're not there yet.
Okay.
Okay, step by step. In other words, the wood that I'm fighting for is literally under a microscope, nothing but molecules. But I don't care about molecules. I want the wood for the fire. So now the wood becomes mithya and molecules become satyam. Why? Because the wood needs the molecules for its existence. Is there a contradiction between the wood and molecules? No. Is there a contradiction between the Buddha statue made out of wood, the wood itself, and the molecules? Which one is it? Is the Buddha statue wood, or is it molecules? Or is it the Buddha statue? It's all three simultaneously. So now the molecules go, wait a minute, we're made up of something even smaller. We're made up of atoms. We need atoms for our existence because a molecule is nothing but atoms put together. So, goodbye Satyam status for the molecules. They now gain Mithya status because they depend on atoms. atoms become satyam. Because from atoms, you build molecules, molecules come together, they bind together to form wood, and wood into a statue that we're willing to pay $10,000 and start fights over on a Black Friday. Which one is it now? I'm buying atoms? $10,000 for atoms put together under a microscope? It's ridiculous. But I don't care about atoms. Give me back the statue. I am happy with that because my mind can handle that much. But if you look at atoms, you can reduce this further. It reduces into electron, proton, nucleus. That literally makes up what we call an atom. We're talking science. We're not talking a belief here. Therefore, those three components, whatever they are, electron, proton, neutron, make up what we call an atom. Are you buying electrons now? Protons? The wood? The molecules? The atom? The Buddha statue? What are you fighting over? Is there any contradiction between the atoms, the molecules, the wood, the Buddha statue? No contradiction. Only name and form changes. The substance keeps on reducing, reducing, reducing. Now you have atoms, protons and neutrons. You go even smaller according to the scientific standard model, quarks, even smaller. I'm now buying quarks, my goodness. God knows what quarks are made of. Science cannot quite tell you. Yes, I've done the research. You can say even photons, light particles, and gravitons are even smaller. It doesn't matter. Quarks are good enough for now. Smallest of the smallest. They say, we don't know what's smaller. Bosons, maybe. Virtual particles, who knows? Now, Vedanta comes in and says, there's something even, quote, smaller. Not that it's smaller, but there is a substance which science has no access to. It's not something that you can infer nor perceive. You need a pramana, a lineage, to show you. If you look at those quarks, are they just randomly put together? Are the atoms randomly put together? Are those molecules randomly just put together? All across the board, from the smallest quark to the atom, to the molecule, to the lignin, to the cellulose, they're all put together all the way to a full-grown tree. In fact, they're put together all the way to the seed of a tree. Now, where is the tree inside the seed? Where are the leaves inside a seed? They're there, but can I see them? I should see a tree. I should see apples inside that seed, but I don't. And yet, out of the seed, intelligently grows a tree, little by little, little by little, and it forms an amazing creation that's able to respond to the heat of the sun and supply birds their nests and give fruits and respond to seasons. Where is all of that stored? Inside the seed? In other words, the seed contains the intelligence for a tree. But where is the physical tree? I don't see it. And yet there is a intelligence, a potential for an entire world of forms to come. But I don't see that potential. Although I know it, it's here. Because the tree comes out of the seed. In other words, just like this quarks, they come out of potential. They come out of intelligence. They come out of concepts, mere concepts. Now, when I say concepts, I'm not talking about mental concepts. Because that becomes now the world is in your mind. This is called subjective idealism. I'm talking about a blueprint from which the quarks come, from which the atoms bind together intelligently. Is this a belief? Look at your cell. It's responding intelligently. It takes the sugar, one single cell, converts sugar, glucose. It sends it to the mitochondria, another part of your cell, responsible for distributing energy throughout. When the mitochondria breaks down in your cell, what happens? You have to take the mRNA, a small sample of DNA from the nucleus of the cell, and you have to put that onto the ribosome, which is another component in the cell. The ribosome converts that mRNA into a protein. A protein gets sent to the Golgi body, another part of the cell, to complete that protein, and that protein knows where to go into the mitochondria to repair the mitochondria which is broken. How is this possible? Where's the brain in the cell? And yet there is an intelligence that every cell knows exactly what to do and how to do it. All in this world, you can take any object, never mind the wood, and you keep reducing to the smallest. It ultimately reduces into mere concepts. You cannot find a final tangible building block of the universe. You can't find it under a microscope. We're still looking under the CERN center in, was it Switzerland or Sweden? One of those. Vedanta saves you $20 million, I heard they spend on that. And they say everything comes from intelligence. And it's not a belief, because you observe any creation and there's an intelligent putting together of the smallest to the largest to the largest to the largest, all the way from a quark to a seed. And even the seed itself has intelligence, from which comes an entire tree. And this concept, again, is not a mental concept, because I know how kind of you can say, oh, these are mental concepts, it's all in my mind. Concept means it is an undefinable blueprint. You cannot define into something. You can only infer. It must be there, because you cannot have something come out of nothing. You cannot have something that is intelligent, all the way from the smallest to the largest, come out of a non-intelligent entity. It comes out of intelligence, a blueprint for how, as the particles come together, all the way they make into a beautiful tree. And we don't see any of this. We just say, cut the trees, make money off this tree. So if the whole universe, like this, reduces to concepts, reduces to intelligence, from which comes forms, then you don't have to analyze everything. You don't have to now analyze this and that and kind of we've done wood. Now let's analyze leaf. We've done leaf. Let's analyze sun. You take anything in this universe, keep reducing. It ultimately reduces to concepts. The blueprint for how a sun is going to work, how far it will be from the earth, how seasons will work, how strong the gravity will be, how much your heart has to pump to negate the pull of the gravity downwards. It has to work specifically enough to be able to pump the blood back up. That is already thought of. Way before you were here, what's already thought of is how would the ecosystem function? How would the seasons interact with the ecosystem? How would the water recycle? Don't worry about it. It's already built in. The heat will evaporate the ocean water. It will go inside, evaporate into the clouds, and the clouds will rain and put clean, fresh water. Did you think of this? It was already provided way before you and I were here. The recycling system is already built in. We just use it. We look at a bird, Wright brothers in 1800s, and go, wow, look at the way they fly and maneuver themselves in the air. Let's use the bird to replicate and create airplanes. The airplanes you're riding, driving, whatever, flying today, is because of the birds. We just look at nature, which is intelligence, and we replicate it for our own use. I heard there was an 11-year-old boy, if I'm not mistaken, he was somewhere around there, and he noticed the way that the branches position themselves in reference to the sun. And he says, why don't we position solar panels in the same pattern that the branches are looking at the sun? And I found they could extract about 20 plus minus more energy just by the positioning of the solar panels following the patterns of the trees. Who thought of how the trees will face the sun to extract maximum sunlight? Not you, not I. It was already thought of way before you and I came here. So the whole world, everything in the world, reduces into concepts because the whole world is nothing but an intelligent putting together. Therefore, now the final question comes and you ask, what is the relationship between concepts and awareness? Now, concept becomes mithya and awareness becomes the final satyam. Is there any contradiction between wood and the Buddha statue made out of wood? No. Any contradiction between the atom and the molecule? Any contradiction between the quark and the concept? Any contradiction between the concept and awareness? It is a satya-mithya relationship. It depends. One depends on the other. Awareness remaining free of the concept depends upon awareness. And we will investigate further what this means and try to understand it much deeper in our session tomorrow. Am I over time?
This evening, yes. Yes, it's 40 past 5.
Am I over time?
Yeah.
Okay, so we will continue this tomorrow.
Tonight.
This evening.
I know, but tonight we do Bhagavad Gita. Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnam Eva Avashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.